In this video, we're going to go behind the scenes on the visual effects breakdown for Mortal Kombat. This is part 4 in the 5-part series. We're exploring magic and energy effects. Throughout this video, we're going to dig deep into deconstructing the visual effects process for the film from the unique perspective of a visual effects supervisor. We'll be discussing the work involved, the techniques, the technology, the process, all of the sequences of the film and how they were created. I'm Alan McKay, I'm a visual effects supervisor in Hollywood. I've been working in the industry for over 25 years at studios like Industrial Light and Magic and dozens of other leading visual effects studios. On projects like Game of Thrones, Transformers, Star Trek, Superman, Avengers Endgame, my goal is to teach artists and creators the skills and the knowledge to be able to build a successful career in the creative industry, as well as the business side of being an artist. This is a 5-part video series. Each day this week I'll be reviewing a new sequence from the film, as well as a compilation of all the effects at the end of the week. The goal is simply to break down and explain the shots and the challenges for each of these sequences, and share my thoughts as a visual effects supervisor on how I would approach these. Typically, we're handed a script and we've got to break down exactly what we need to do and allocate the right studios and the right people to each of these sequences. So this is an opportunity to be able to break down my thoughts on how I would approach a lot of these sequences, as well as discuss a lot of what's involved in the creative process. By the way, if you're enjoying this channel, all the content I make in this channel I make for free, and all I ask in return is if you could please subscribe and like this video. It might not mean much to you, but it'll mean the world to me, and you won't miss out on any of the upcoming content that I release daily. Finally, if there's a particular movie that you want to see covered in the upcoming visual effects breakdowns, let me know. Leave a comment below, I'd love to hear from you. As well as any questions that maybe I haven't covered yet, I'm happy to answer all of those as well. So, let's get started. Okay, so let's talk about all the kind of fireball effects that we got going on here. I think it'd be fun to just dig into this a little bit and just talk a bit about the process. And so with the effect here, just to discuss it a little bit, like the fire itself is extremely oversaturated compared to what you would typically go for fire. However, it's meant to be magic, so I think that that's totally fine. Now, just to talk a bit about a few things here, one thing to keep in mind is that there is some subtle glow added on here, a few things like that, and any of these sorts of effects over a white background is always going to get some banding and some weirdness in there, and that's pretty common. So that's always just really funny when you get clients saying like add glow, and it's like the background's white, you can't add glow because glow is additive, and they're like, no, I want glow, and they don't really get, when you're working with a white background, a lot of additive effects don't work too well. So all this stuff down here works really well. Unfortunately, all the stuff up here, you're going to get some bleeding and banding and some weird stuff. I feel like overall there isn't really too much detail to some of this fire, but kind of doesn't need it. It looks good. It kind of fits the style that it needs to be. Just to talk, I'm going to try and plow through this pretty quickly, but just to talk a bit about some of the fireball stuff. Basically you got a fireball, and there's dozens of ways to do that. I mean, it's pretty straightforward to have like a sphere object or whatever you want to do, maybe have some particles shooting out if you want to do it that way. Some people work with, I use particles for everything because I can control everything then, because then they have attributes, but some people just prefer to hand animate spheres and go into a lot of pain dealing with that stuff. But just to talk a bit about the impact, because just to go back to this for a second, you can see that as it hits, it kind of splashes out everywhere. Now, what this is actually doing is it's a particle system. So you got these particles here creating these trails of fire that shoot out everywhere. And then you got more of this kind of radial splash of fire going around it. So to do that sort of effect, because it's really important, like you break things into elements. I think that a lot of people get confused when you're doing all of these fluid effects that it needs to be like one simulation. But really what you're doing is you're breaking into, like I said, the fireball that's going, this is like side view, So you can have the fireball, and then what you'll do is you'll have like a radial set of particles that shoot out. This is meant to be from the side. So you'll see that it kind of splashes out like that. And if I were to do this from like the front, you're pretty much just getting particles to shoot out in every direction. And that is making it feel like it's splashing, it's impacting. And yeah, so that's pretty important. Then you're gonna have these like really fine particulate trails shooting out as well. And these would be a separate set of particles, probably a separate sim as well, because what's actually happening, you can't see it, but there's actually like all this fuel that's kind of just sitting in the air. And because of that, all of the fire would tend to kind of get messed up. So you end up with at least three, might be hard to see that color, but three elements. So we got the trails, we got the splash, and we got the fireball itself, and all of these come together. So hopefully that makes sense. But this is breaking down all the different elements so you get a better understanding of how this stuff works. Now, I'll move on, but I just want to kind of go through some of these effects really quickly. Other than that, you got the smoke. Typically, you can have the smoke actually generate automatically based on when all the fire burns up, all the fuel begins to burn up. And then you have these dust elements here on the ground. And those are also simulated. One thing you can do that works really well, and this is actually happening here, is like whenever you get a chance to actually add in wind, so you get this like slight drift of wind as these elements hit. Whenever you can do this, it just makes everything feel way more integrated, way more alive, way more like it's tied into the real world. So it's really important to have that. And it's just such a subtle thing, but adding wind into your effects, a lot of the time everything just looks quite real. And a lot of the time, effects artists tend to forget that. You know, they get the simulation right, they're not thinking about adding wind. And it's just such a subtle thing, but it's night and day different. So to also talk about this is another shot, another fireball, but now we're indoors. A couple things I'll quickly mention. I believe that the heat distortion is just a 2D radial effect, so there's just like a radial mask going out with noise, and you've just got that distorting the plate. I think that that's actually handled in comp. This here, same thing, it's just the fireball element that's been simulated before. It's quite saturated, same deal. And there we see the follow through here as well. Now what's really important here is that this is actually an interior shot, and so the interactive lighting is really important. There is interactive lighting on the outdoor shots as well, and we'll talk about that in a second, but this is really important. Like, it really helps sell the shot, because if this was just a bit of fire flying by him and didn't actually affect him, then it would be a whole other conversation. I think that in this case, the lighting, it could be actually captured in frame, but I'm assuming that that was just added in comp. Just roto him and add in some interactive lighting. And you're just going to make that lighting flicker, so that way it feels more like it's actually alive, like it's a real fire element. So, like I said, it's very subtle, but there is actually lighting happening here, and I think it is just complete roto. It's not actually being shot or lit in the actual shot itself. Okay, so let's just quickly talk about the hand flames. Pretty straightforward stuff, but I just figured I'd give some insight into this. So, whether it's his hand or he's wearing a glove, and then it's just being replaced, I'd assume a lot of the stuff actually has like an LED thing in his hand that's actually glowing. So that's what I assume is going on. And you could do it without it. You could just totally be like, okay, CG flame, and call it a day. But the thing is that you want to have something like that for interactive lighting, because it's actually then going to splash light all over him. And the reason why I think it makes sense is the glove. I don't have the full shot here, I'm kind of clipping it out, but he actually has his hand down and he turns it up. So it just makes sense to just give him a glove that has an LED lighting in it, and then from there, just go in and doctor his hand if you need it to actually look like skin. And the most important thing then is that you're going to get that flare. And by the way, like, this flare, all the glow and everything else, that I believe is all shot in camera. That's actually from the LED lighting in his hand. Again, could be wrong, but that's what I would do, and it's also what I think has happened. And then they're just adding in CG Flame in there, probably just doing a hand track or something, so that way you've got a skin hand, but mostly to include the fire and everything else. So pretty straightforward, and that's why I wonder if the lens flare here is actually shot in camera too, or whether it's added in post. And again here you can see that it's actually playing a role, it's actually lighting him in the shot. And then you have it here with two of them, same thing, you can see it's actually illuminating him, so it's pretty beneficial to have that, it's just going to really help sell the shot. Okay, jumping into lightning, I'll go through this stuff. I think like most of my focus is actually going to be here. So lightning back in the day was actually kind of difficult to do, and it's not like it's a huge technological feat, it's just that there wasn't really a good practical way to do it. So usually you would do a couple things, is either paint, so like paint box I should say to make it a bit more obvious, like you would paint frame by frame lightning everywhere, kind of like Roto in a way. And that's something you would do so that way you could create lightning kind of dancing around, and you get some really ethereal kind of effects from doing that. And you think back to like Conan the Barbarian and so many other movies back in the day, like you would be doing this quite a lot. So paintbox is one approach. Then there's like stock footage or shooting elements separately, so you get like Tesla coils or other things to be able to utilize and comp in. But ultimately, when you're doing 3D, most of the time it would look really terrible, because what you would have is pretty much just like 2 points and a spline being generated along it. And so you get these really dumb kind of like lines going across, and you kind of have some of that stuff down here a little bit. But then what you could do, and we did that at Blur Studio quite a lot, is that there was a plugin for Fusion that would create lightning. And so what it would actually do is it would just create forks going off of it, so essentially secondary lightning forks happening on the effect. So even with like whatever software you want to use, usually all it's doing is generating a lightning, you know, kind of squiggly spline. And then from there, with that spline, you could then in post kind of add in some forks to it to make it a bit more interesting. But ultimately, it always looks really terrible. The first time I've really seen 3D lightning done well was through Weta. And Weta did all the Tesla kind of invention stuff for the Prestige. And it was phenomenal. They did a really good job, and obviously they wrote their own algorithm or built something for it. And the way that it worked, from my understanding, is that it would create a fork, but it would then create subforks, and these subforks would be attracted to something, and they would have like a set lifespan kind of randomized of where they try and like connect to something. So that's kind of how I do lightning these days, is that you're creating a system that's searching for something to connect to. So let's just say that I had a lightning bolt here, it would have like a set lifespan, like distance, that it would randomly jump down to, and it's phasing all the time, so it's like a different seed each time. But at a certain point, it's then going to send the signal to branch out, and it's going to look for an attraction point. It's going to say, okay, Sonia, I'm going to hit your head. That looks like a nice helmet for me to hit. So it would branch out into those areas. But then you would have a control system to say, well, how many additional forks do you want to have branch off? And even sub-forks from there. So you can get something that's really interesting if you want to like emphasize scale or something. So that's kind of how you would do it, where you would have like one fork and then it would break into others, but they're searching within an area to try and make a contact point. It could be on the ground, it could be anywhere. And that works really well. Like it's quite effective. So when we're talking about this stuff here, when we're talking about this stuff here, it's kind of the same thing, where there are actually just multiple elements. In other words, we're going to have, it's going to be off screen, so you won't see it, but like basically you would have like forks going through here, so you'd have like a few set up that would do that. And then there would be a system to say, okay, well, now that they're doing that, perhaps they attract to each other, so you might see some like thinner versions that are actually attaching to each other. It's just to kind of give additional detail, and there might actually be some additional subforks going down too. And that's kind of the brunt of it. And then there's going to be some additional stuff kind of spilling out from there. But that, as far as I can tell, is essentially triggered from like 3 or 4, you know, is one area, like one center point, but it's forking out into a few that come down. And so that would be your main bolt, your main element. And if you look at this, that's exactly what's going on, is that you have this area that's initially wide, and then it kind of shrinks down and then dissipates. That's one big effects element right there, the big vertical element that appears. All the other stuff interacting with him, that's going to be a different simulation. And, you know, I mentioned particles a lot, but honestly, particles is just a way to control things. And so with a lot of this, you've got one big element that's going down here, and then you've got another one for his staff appearing there. But then from there, you just have this third element, which is just kind of dancing around him. And all you're doing is you're generating points. I don't know what button I'm hitting that's making my brush so big, but I'll have to look into that. But you're generating points. And those points are randomly just popping on and off, on and off. Maybe they last a frame or two, they'd be attached to the geometry. But the whole point, no pun intended, is that these would randomly generate these electrical bursts. So it would look for what's closest and saying, okay, I'm going to search for the next one. And you're not seeing these points, but this is exactly what's happening. If I draw a point there and a point there, this is what's basically happening, is that it's scattering points around the body, and then these are firing for a frame or two, and then they'll disappear. And you could have controls to fork out even more, but they're ultimately trying to connect together. And by having these multiple systems set up, it means you have one that's just scattering, like dancing around the body. And that's more of a secondary effect to make it feel like he's part of it. It's just not some cheesy element. It's moving around and it looks good. But then you'll have one for the pole. Again, I don't know what button I keep hitting. And then you've got this main kind of lightning bolt coming down. And that's the one that's meant to signal that it's kind of teleporting him. So you can see that they kind of dance around. You know, they're just kind of like a third element. But then you have this one here that's kind of attracted just to the pole specifically. And this guy here starts out with a lot of spread, and you're animating that spread value down. So it starts to narrow down, and then you turn it off. Oh, and then from there, in terms of color, stuff like that, you're basically doing a fall-off shader. You know, whether it's Max, Maya, Houdini, whatever, like X-ray or fall-off, Fresnel. There's different setups you can do, but you're essentially saying the center is white, and then the outer sides is going to be blue. And that way you'll get that hot center and be blue on the edges. And then when you go on a comp, you're typically adding like 2 layers of glow. One's going to be really focused, and it's going to make the whole thing very hot. And then the second one, which is more very soft, and it just kind of gives it that haze that's kind of lingering around it. And by the way, I've got some tutorials, at least 2, I think, on how to do lightning and electricity on my YouTube. Check it out there. So same thing here. All you're doing is you're basically saying, in fact, this is a good one to kind of point out. So all of this lightning, they all have turbulence, whatever it is, whether it's FBM turbulence or noise 4. You know, there's lots of different algorithms you can use, but all you're doing is you've got a few different, now I wish my brush was bigger, you've got a few different points that these are coming from, but they're basically firing out to his body, which will have like multiple points or whatever. And the whole idea is that these just follow along, and what's actually happening with this is that there's a random seed that's changing over time. And the scale of this is quite big, so that makes it feel like it's dancing around. If it was very high frequency, then it's going to look like that. But by having this kind of overall arch, what happens is if we look at this, it's such a short thing, it's literally a couple of frames, but you can see that it's starting to dance, like move downward, and then it'll change again. But that's based on the phase and the frequency of the noise pattern that's being given. So it kind of like starts to go from here to down more, And, you know, if you kept it going long enough, you'd probably see it arc up again or something. You can see it in this shot. And I like that as multiple bursts. It kind of pulses, so it's one, and then there's a second one, there's a third one. So it's kind of like bang, bang, bang. It's kind of like a machine gun in a way, the way that it hits, rather than it just being this continuous stream, like if you think of the Emperor or the Sith Lord in Star Wars, like that's kind of more of a continuation. Although if you can't remember the earlier ones, but I think in the later ones you definitely see it's much more kind of on and off, because I feel like that staccato feeling is way more interesting and threatening than it is if it's just like putting your hands out there and firing some like lengthy laser beam. You want this to make it feel like it's very chaotic, very unpredictable, and it's also like repeatedly hitting you. But yeah, like you match move Kano, then you can just have all this electricity kind of like dancing around him. You can see, like, these two frames here is a good example where you see it kind of forks out onto the ground. You're not doing that manually, it's just you have all these points on the ground. And again, like, check out my tutorials on doing this, because that's exactly what we do. I have like a ship taking off, and it's kind of like lightning's kind of dancing around the ground and everything, and that's exactly because you're setting it up to say, hey, find me a point, you know, or find me a point over here. And in this case, it's here, you know, and then the next frame it might snap over here instead, and that's kind of like the setup that you would do for it. And then you got some like fluid sim just to make it feel like he's burning. And again, the more these throw dust and stuff like that in there, it just kind of ties everything together. It also works out well with the glow because it kind of helps justify, or not justify, but it helps tie it all together. So I think the idea here maybe is that he's actually kind of recharging and then he's redistributing that energy. Could be wrong, but this stuff's fun. These days it's a lot easier to do this stuff. I've kind of been slightly obsessed with lightning and electricity just because it's been hard. Like back in the 90s, no one could do fire and smoke and explosions very well, so that was my obsession. And for a while there, this became my obsession just because of that exact reason, trying to build a good system that worked. And these days, it's a lot more easier. So, not to kind of like beat a dead horse, but you can see that these are the main pattern, but then you can see that there's these other ones that are kind of like waving off. Those are the secondary ones that I'm talking about. So, having those in there, it means that you're littering a lot of stuff around that's kind of all over the place. But this main area is really focused like a laser beam. It's doing its thing, and then the other stuff is kind of there to kind of detail it out, but they're all secondary. They're all essentially sub-forks that are happening. So at this point, like I've got plenty of this, but it's going to be the same gag over and over and over. So hopefully this actually kind of points it out, because it's funny that one's really desaturated, the other one's really saturated. But you can see main fork going down here, and then all the sub forks are telling it to go off in this direction. But then you have this other element which is more horizontal, which is what he's walking through to kind of symbolize that he's just teleported in. Oh yeah, skipped over that sky beam. So no Warner Brothers movie is complete without a sky beam. So in this case, it's actually kind of tricky to do a shot like this technically, just because this is all shot on location, and this is all somewhere in Australia. It's some mining area, so probably Western Australia, something like that. And then I'd say that this area up here is a matte painting. Could be, nice stars and dusk and everything, but I'd imagine it's a matte painting, but this is all captured in frame. There is a chance that you could do a matte painting where the foreground element's a different photo element, but yeah, either way, because this is a real location rather than 3D, you're going to need to have some kind of 3D model for this, because you're going to have this beam coming down, and then it kind of interacts and dances around. It's kind of funny because this is a massive scale, but it's doing exactly what Raiden was just doing a second ago. It shoots down, And it's interesting looking at this because, yeah, like the glows are really intense. It's essentially, it's not really a glow, it's a lens flare is usually how you'd pull that off, I think, just because it needs to be really reinforced. But the lightning is actually kind of really does help it a lot, because you're going to have this fine sky beam, but having it kind of fork out and interact with the geometry, or the mountain, I should say, that really kind of helps make it more interesting. And that's the only reason why I'm saying the shot's a bit more complex than it might seem, is just mostly because to get this to kind of fit in the environment, knowing that it's a 2D image, unless you were to actually add 3D geometry everywhere, it makes it a little bit tricky to pull off. And this is where this foreground element is actually what sells it. Without this, it would just feel like you're dropping some 2D lightning over the shot, and you would need to have some kind of additional interaction. But having this occluded, it makes it feel like, okay, yeah, that's in 3D space. So the foreground element really helps the shot. Plus, you always want to shoot landscape with foreground, just because everything is background. There's no midground here. Everything's background, so it's always going to be flat. So same stuff, just more adding points to areas in the hand and letting it do its thing. But hopefully you're getting it. Like, you can see that there's basically scattered points and it's just generating all the stuff. It looks really cool, but it's just, that's the gag that we're rolling with. Same thing, just another Raiden element. And you can just have one artist to do all these. I don't like the glows, by the way. These are... I feel like, because I mentioned there's two sets of glows on all of these, and I feel like this glow, they put the intensity too high with the size too big. Usually you'd want the size to be smaller, and that would make it more hot. So it just kind of feels a little bit cheesy and glowy. Anyway, I think we've seen enough lightning, but it's cool. Like, this stuff's really fun to do. And we got one other pit, another sky beam. Anyway, I had lots of this stuff, but we get the idea, unless I can see something really interesting in here. Hadouken. It's like a big one at the end. Again, I still remember all of Mortal Kombat 1's moves, like Raiden's fatality in Mortal Kombat 1, stand far away, back, 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 forward, forward, low kick. I went around one of my friend's houses late at night, it was like 4 in the morning, went back to her place just to hang out, and because she had beer at her place, and it was California, so all the bars were closed. And she had a Sega Genesis with like one of those old CRT TVs, and yeah, she had a Sega Genesis with Sonic the Hedgehog 2 and Mortal Kombat. And right away I'm like, ABACABB. And she's like, what's that? I'm like, that's the blood code, so you can activate blood in Mortal Kombat. So here's some stuff to talk about with his whole like freezing effect. Now, this is pretty straightforward too, and when I say straightforward, I just mean as in like, I don't know, it's pretty straightforward. Like, this sort of stuff is not to say there's not hard to do, but the approach is pretty clear what you need to do. And usually you're still going to go through a lot of look dev, like just because you know how to pull off this effect doesn't mean that there weren't 30 other versions of this that look completely different before they arrived at this thing. So however it reveals itself, you just basically have like this cluster of instance geometry, which are like ice crystals, and they're all sitting inside as a sphere. And so you imagine you got this like circle here, but inside of there it's just these ice crystals, and they're all kind of told to separate from each other, so that way they're not clunking up or clustering together or anything. Clumping is the word I was looking for. So they all kind of have some kind of distance repulsion from each other, but they're not locked in space either, so they're kind of all attracted to the same point. So the whole thing is they're going to flow around a little bit. And what you would do is you would just animate a sphere and have the sphere scale out, and then he throws the sphere. You literally could just get the previs and plug it in if you really wanted to be a smartass about it. I've done that plenty of times. And so then from there you're just adding some kind of mist fluid sim on top as well. And that will become more obvious when you see it in motion. But what's really interesting, you don't really get to see it here, but we just go back a couple frames, you can see like his hands are emitting mist, like a fluid mist the whole time. But you just have this this sphere that's just kind of like floating in between his hands. And again, you could do this procedurally, but you'd hand animate this stuff. You're not going to go and try and make everything automated. That's the one thing I'm just going to point out. I get hired to do demos all the time for all these big software companies, and you go and do these procedural workflows where the whole thing is automated, and people think that that's what we actually do in production. It's nice to have certain aspects automated, like all the bits all separate from each other, with the repulsion, but you don't automate everything because you're losing control from doing that. So most of the time, like, everything's a cheap gimmick. It's not as intelligent as you might think it is. It's nice to have that stuff, but most of the time you're actually limiting yourself more than giving yourself control. So you would just hand animate a sphere, and this stuff essentially would just kind of like undulate around it. From there though, like in some of the other shots, you'll see it. What actually happens is he'll have particles that are attracted to it. So his hands will actually have additional little icicles that are attracted to the sphere. So they continue to kind of like follow out to it and kind of reinforce it. So that's an additional thing. And you'll have like the mist around it all. And so these guys are just attracted to the center of that. Because again, like you have this sphere in the center. They're just told that's your target. Like if you're talking about like, let's say particle flow in 3ds Max, back in the day, this would be a find target, it's a FT, and they're just following that. And if they get to it, let's say that the ball was just to sit there in world space, they would actually flow past and come back again, kind of like a Newton gravity. They just continue to fly through it. In fact, you see it a little bit. So these little particles, maybe you'll see it in the next few shots. And then when it hits him, it's kind of like Liu Kang. You're just doing this explosion of ice. Shooting out. This is more of the same. So this is what I'm talking about here. So this is a perfect example where you see all the mist around his hands, and then you'll see there's two systems being built here. One is these little icicles that, like I said, are coming out of his hands right now, and eventually they will attract into the sphere. But then you have the main sphere, and this is building up right now. So what you'll have is you've got like the sphere will expand a little bit. You'll have a lot of ice particles inside, and all of it's kind of scaling up and building out into something right now. So it kind of starts from nothing, and then you got the mist. So you can see the small stuff is actually kind of flowing towards the center sphere that's building up. But it's not like these guys are actually from his hands. These are just magically being spawned on. So it just kind of builds up the whole thing. So you got all this stuff kind of fluttering around to help tie it all together, make it feel like it's coming from his hands. But this element is basically just a sphere with all this stuff kind of following it. Not locked to it, but following it. So you can see all the smaller particles compared to the bigger one. So I'm not sure what's happening in the sequence, but you can tell Liu Kang's building a fireball up, because then you see the lighting turn off. And I'd assume that they're just doing comp lighting, like they're augmenting this in comp. As long as you have DPXs, so you got dynamic range, you can do a lot with that. And yes, there's just lots of ice. And these are just rigid body sims from a particle system. And this is, standard shape kind of growing out. More ice. You get the idea. So it's just like a lot of these gags, but they look good. It's lots of elements. And I think that's the important takeaway here, is that don't just do one sim or one effect. It's lots of different sims that are building out to make one effect. Okay, so this is just some random stuff we got here. This was a flashback, I guess, that we kept in here. So this is just some of that fire stuff, but it's very similar to the other stuff in the same family. Like you can see there's essentially vectors that this stuff's flowing over. Because I talk about using particles a lot of the time, and this stuff, it's points, so whether you treat it as particles or however you want to do it, essentially it is particles, but the way it's being driven isn't, let's say, turbulence or stuff like that. I mean, not by itself. It's essentially velocity fields that the stuff is kind of flowing over. So you get like a very direct driven stream going through it. Looks really cool. And then that drives fluids and everything. So I haven't really looked through here, but I say this is just a bunch of fluid sims, and then you're putting particles inside of it, advecting them, so they follow very kind of defined streams based on like thresholds of density, stuff like that. And it's just like a lot of that stuff going on, and then heat distortions on top of that. So I'd say it's a combination of a few things, but that's generally it. It's all fluid driven, and you got some particle elements and stuff like that too, or this could be fluids. I feel like it's particles. Turbulence is so underrated. Like a lot of the stuff, like a lot of the effect stuff that I do these days is still following the same approach that I was doing 20 years ago. It's just easier now. Okay, so this is like, I think I call this like Shang Tsung Evil Magic or something, or Evil Teleport. But basically this is just all the teleportation effects. And all this is, it's pretty straightforward. I say that a lot, but it is. It looks cool, so don't think it's simplifying at all. But this is what I'm saying, that it's very similar to the family of stuff that's in this movie. Like everything I feel kind of borrows from itself. So when you think of Cole's suit, I mentioned that you would have like this area, you know, kind of like flow out, and then it would populate these kind of strands, and then they all kind of flow with it. And that's exactly what's happening here, where you'll have like these fingers all flowing out, but they're all following the same kind of velocity as they go out. And the whole point is that these guys are just fingers of particles that kind of flow out, that they're probably fluid driven, but then they're spawning more fluids. And there's going to be a point where a lot of this stuff starts to kind of come back in. This stuff is very turbulent, as in like the head of it all, they're very turbulent. And it's just a lot of this stuff kind of coming out, like it's a attract and repel. It's coming out and being attracted back in, coming out, being attracted back in, but it has multiple turbulences on it, so it's all swirling together. And the thing is, all of that is then spawning this fluid. So you get these smoky trails, but they all build up over time. So then you end up with this like huge amount of fluid all flowing and going crazy, and it looks really, really cool. But it's all being driven by kind of the same idea in a lot of ways that Cole's suit would work. That you basically have like a few paths that they follow, and then those are multiple points that follow those paths, and they spawn lots of fluids. But it looks really cool. It's really fine. Yeah, but some of this stuff with the lighting looks really neat. I like it. And let me know if you want a tutorial on some of this stuff. I could totally do that. There's a few shots like this that there's an actual like physical teleport. Some of that stuff like maybe, and it could be the same for all of it, and I'm just not getting to see the full thing because these shots are so short. But there is a set of geometry that I feel like some of these are flowing or respecting, kind of following. So as it's doing all this, in addition, it's also it's kind of got some additional layers of geometry or something to kind of help with that. And then you got stuff like this, where there's a few different ways you can do this. You could actually do it in reverse, which sounds like it's cheating, but there's no such thing as cheating when it comes to pulling off a shot. The only bad thing is sometimes you might pull things off a certain way, and then the director says, this shot is approved, I just need you to do this one thing. And unfortunately that one thing breaks the system. So then you got to cheat it or rework everything just because of that. So that's always the tricky thing. But something like this, I would say that it's just all attracted in. Which, there's a shot of Sub-Zero I'm covering in the next lesson. I'm covering Scorpion and Sub-Zero, their big sequences. But there's one where he kind of disappears into an alley. I'm probably not going to cover that, but that's where, again, you could just do it in reverse. But I feel like they actually had this fluid of mist, and then it all just kind of sucks in. And so they actually did it correct, opposed to cheating. I'm kind of wondering whether I would have cheated. I don't know. So, but yeah, I feel like this is the same thing. So you had the actual effects, and then it just all kind of gets sucked in. But you could have totally cheated on that. And then this stuff here looks really cool. Again, it's just all kind of, you know, the fingers all spiraling out, and that's just generating all this fluid that's like shifting around. And that's meant to take Goro away. Okay, so there's a few effects in here of Cabal and Liu Kang. I'm not sure what else we got, but let's see. So I feel like this stuff's done a few different ways. This shot in particular, I'm gonna play it on loop. It's gonna play it on loop. So this shot in particular, I think this is actually done entirely in comp. So you could probably just shoot him on a green screen, have that as a backplate, and you know, do it this way. But the way this is done, okay, it's not entirely in comp, but I feel like most of this is comp. So you see these strands here, these are particles, and I think that this was a 3D particle element, but then they've added these extra kind of plasma bits in, and I feel like that's actually just comp, the way that it's moving and everything. Again, could be wrong, but I feel like a majority of the time you just have these long strands everywhere. So here's Fireball. I like this Fireball, it's got way more detail than a majority of the other Fireballs did. Okay, so this is the other thing. His weapons, I feel, are done differently to when his body travels. I think his body is, I feel, is just a few different points in his body are generating these trails wherever it goes, and it's just kind of emitting based on distance, so you get these really fine streaks. Whereas this stuff, it's kind of the same thing, but I'm kind of wondering whether maybe there was like an operator or a plugin, kind of like, again, I'm going to reference Max, but just because like it was an old school thing called Ghost Trails, but it did a really good job in this sort of thing. But I feel like these aren't particles, they're straight up streaks. And I feel like that's just for the weapons more than anything. So maybe with the first shot, it is 3D, but like this stuff is there too. It just doesn't feel like it's attached to anything. You have the particle streaks, you'll see them more in the other shots, but then there's this other stuff that just kind of sits there. And in the first shot here, you don't really see it move. It just feels like you have some kind of texture or something. It looks a bit weird. So here's more of those ghost trails I'm talking about. And then these are the really fine particles I'm talking about. So you can see that these particle elements are very different to the rest of this kind of just gunky plasma stuff. It could be like a 3D density map that just emits like a volume, pretty much. So it's like volumetrics, but they don't really interact or do anything. And then you have the particle trail, so that way, as long as something is interacting and moving around, it makes it all feel like it all is. That's like a trick that you do quite a lot. So you can see it's more of the kind of really fine particle elements. And then you have that gunky stuff that just sits there. It's kind of weird. So that's why I feel like it could just be like a 3D volume or something. And this was just a bunch of random stuff. So I didn't talk about Kano's laser. I just feel like it's not worth talking about. But I mean, it's cool, but I don't feel like it's really worth deciphering like what method did they use or anything. I just figured I'd walk through this stuff. I haven't really looked at it too much. So I mean, I feel like a majority of the stuff is just in comp. You're just using elements. In fact, I mean, you know, obviously that is like 100%. That's why I feel like comp stock stuff always has a look to it because the head might move around and it kind of just stays tracking it. This fire looks way more detailed than any of the other stuff. And I think it's because it's so close to camera and the background's so dark that they kind of need to bring the levels down and not blow it out, so you actually get to appreciate a lot of the detail. And this is what I mean, like, these weapons, when they move, that's why I'm saying ghost trails, because the particle elements are way more squiggly, way more line defined. And these just feel like straight up geometry or something, just following behind it. Fluid sim, just tracking that wound on his arm. Or I would probably do it the other way around. I'd keep the wound on his arm from the get-go, and you would roto it out if you even see it. But yeah, and then you use those points as a way to, as a position on screen to do the fluid sim. So yeah, I mean, this is a little bit different to the other lessons. I know I said that about the last one too, but it's more just like miscellaneous different effects. And it was just fun to kind of like talk through some of the stuff, the lightning, the teleporters, the Sub-Zero stuff. Next lesson, the final lesson, we're going to get into Sub-Zero's arrival when he goes to Earthrealm or whatever. And then also Scorpion, the opening sequence in the movie where he takes out like 20 people, and we'll talk about that fight sequence, which is very VFX heavy. So, I hope you're enjoying this. I hope you're getting a lot from it. Leave a comment. Feel free to share this with others so that way they can benefit from it as well. I'd love to get the word out so that way others can enjoy these too. And like I said, I'm going to be doing Transformers next week. And then from there, I'm going to see how I feel about whether I want to continue doing these or maybe pivot. We'll see. So again, just let me know, give me some feedback on how you're enjoying these and whether you want to see these being done every week, 6 days a week, which is pretty intense. I literally felt like taking a break after just doing Mortal Kombat. It's been pretty daunting, and I'm also launching a technical director course, and I'm also putting out some free training tutorials. There's a lot of stuff coming in July, which I'm going to announce very soon. You might have noticed I'm posting a lot more actively on YouTube, and that's one thing that I'm going to put out a video and just kind of announce like what the game plan is, just because I want to start really leaning in here and trying to see how much of an impact I can make on a lot of your careers, both with teaching behind the scenes visual effects stuff, but also how to build out your career and get the success that you deserve. Learning to negotiate, price yourself, how to attract the right kind of jobs and the right kind of clients, and really create those opportunities that you want for yourself. So lots to get into. Thanks again for watching. I appreciate you, and I'll be back next video. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll be back tomorrow with the next part in the series. Each week I plan to review a different film and share as many insights as I can with you. And if there's a particular movie that you want to see, leave a comment below and let me know. Or if there's any big questions not answered in this video that you would like to see covered, let me know as well. I'd love to hear from you. Creating these videos weekly is a lot of work, but I love sharing and I love helping creatives like you. All I ask, if you want to support this channel as well as ensure I can create more of these videos, is if you could please subscribe to this channel, as well as feel free to spread the word to others about these videos. As I said, it mightn't mean much to you, but it'll mean the world to me. And you won't miss out on any of the upcoming videos that I'll be putting out daily. This has been an absolute pleasure. All the content I make for free, so that way we can all get a better understanding of the visual effects process and the filmmaking process as well. Finally, one last thing, I recently released a free course on how to raise your prices and land your dream clients as an artist. I've been in the industry for over 25 years, both as an artist as well as a manager, hiring artists and managing them, and of course paying them as well. So I'm very familiar with this topic. For me, it's a pet peeve that people say that there's no money in art, that art's not a career, or art doesn't pay. I want to eliminate the starving artist mindset for good. That's why I've created this 8-hour free course on everything I know about how to price yourself as an artist, and how to raise your prices and land your dream clients that are willing to pay you what you're worth. At least for now, this course is completely free to download, so get the entire 8-hour free course at pricingclass.com, or click the link in the description below to check it out there as well. And if you like this video, I put another video somewhere above me that I think you're going to like as well as a link to the playlist for all the visual effects breakdowns I've created, so that way you can absorb all of those too. I'm Alan McKay, thanks for watching.